Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So, if you want to know about the common security threats unique to the accounts payable function, resources for free and paid training to prevent fraud, vendor setup and maintenance processes to avoid fraud, and a 5-step process to customize training to prevent fraud, keep listening. Welcome to episode 310, Bridging the Gap from Cybersecurity Awareness Training to Customized Training to Prevent Payment Fraud in 5 steps. Now, this is actually a webinar, 30-minute webinar. It was actually 32 minutes, I think, that I had on back in July. And since we are coming into fraud season, year end, I thought it might be good to try to give you some ideas of how you can bridge that gap, plus tell you what to look for. So enjoy, and I hope you take away some immediate takeaways that can help your team as you go into year end. Oh, and I did want to mention that I am going to put a link to the recording where you can go and watch it if you like, or at the very least, go and download the handout so you can follow along with the podcast if you like. So take a listen. Hope you like it.
All right, so we are right at the top of the hour, and I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a lot of information for today. If you guys have been on any of my webinars in the past, you know I always try to jam as much information I can in the time period allowed, and so no different from today. So today's monthly webinar series in 5 steps, and you can follow that hashtag on LinkedIn if you want to see more in 5 steps webinars in the future. They're all free. You can register to either attend live or watch on demand. But this month, we're talking about bridging the gap from cybersecurity awareness training to really customized fraud training to prevent payment fraud. And we're going to talk about how you can do that in 5 steps. My name is Debra R. Richardson, or I am Debra R. Richardson, and I'll get into a really brief bio in just a moment. But first, I do want to remind you that the session is being recorded. Tomorrow, you're going to receive a different link, yes, a different link, to register if you would like to watch the recording, and you'll also be able to download the handouts again if you missed any of those. But it is a different link you need to register with because it is set up so that you can also download I can attach the handouts to those, and you can download it, or any colleague or other team members that you think would find the content relevant, you can share that link with them, and then they'll be able to watch the recording and download the handouts as well. It's really the only way I can do that. So keep in mind, it is a separate link. Now, you can submit your questions anytime. I am going to save them for Q&A, but if you submit them before then, I should have up to 5 minutes for a Q&A. I'll be able to get right started started right away on answering those questions. And then finally, don't forget to download the handouts. I think I have three. One is, of course, a PDF of this presentation, and then I also have a vendor validation reference list with resource links, which I'll talk about. And then I also have a vendor process training center training schedule for 2024, which I'll also talk about. Now, really quickly, a brief bio on me. Again, I am Debra Richardson. I'm a certified fraud examiner, but I used to be a practitioner. I was a senior AP manager over vendor setup and maintenance. I had a team of 17. All we did was vendor setup and maintenance requests. We processed about 2,000 requests for vendor setups, vendor adds and changes per month. We maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs. And as you can imagine, that is a lot of opportunity for fraud. But now I work with teams like yours to add authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, vendor validations to avoid not only fraud, but also fines and just overall bad vendor data. Now, today's agenda really is a lot of information, but we're packing it into 3 different sections. One is fraudsters are evolving. Are we keeping up? And by we, I mean it's the cybersecurity awareness training that you probably have keeping up. And then we'll talk about the 5 steps customized training to prevent fraud. And first, though, we have our only poll question. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And if you can tell me how often is your cybersecurity awareness training required? Is it annually? Is it quarterly? Is it some other time period, recurring time period, or are you just unsure? So go ahead and answer. Again, that is our only poll question of the webinar today, and would love to get some responses here. So go ahead and answer: annual, quarterly, other time period, or unsure. All right, so it looks like we've got some folks answering. I'll probably wait till we get to about 70%. I'll give it another 10 seconds or so. So if you haven't answered, go ahead and respond. Again, how often is your cybersecurity awareness training required? All right, so looks like we've got 62%, almost got to 70. If you haven't voted, go ahead and vote. Everyone counts. And looks like we're at 75%. I love it, guys. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, but I'm going to share the results. So it looks like we have 40%. Oh, God, it kind of goes down in this order. So the highest is 40% annually. Quarterly is the next one at 27%. 20% is other, and then 13% is unsure. So thanks everyone for answering that. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and then we're going to go ahead and start with fraudsters are evolving. Are we keeping up? And by that I mean, is the cybersecurity awareness training really keeping up? And I wanted to share some slides that I presented at the Convene conference that's put on by the National Cybersecurity Alliance organization. This was back in January, and I really went there to talk to the cybersecurity leaders, your CISOs, right, to talk about what I think is missing in their cybersecurity awareness training so that they can work with you or work with leadership to get more focused training. And so I'll share with you what I presented, some of what I presented to them. Now, what I told them is that, right, these are some of the biggest fraud threats that are currently the accounts payable team, the vendor team, the financial operations team, right? Anyone that deals with P2P that can be in that process towards a fraudulent payment. And so the first thing is that the average fraud is not the millions that we think about or hear about in the media. It's actually 134,000, right, per incident, and that's based on the FBI's 2023 report of IC3 complaints. So again, they are not only after those millions of payments, are actually after smaller payments. So now more, or really every size business, is a target of fraudsters. Also, check fraud has been increasing since 2021. Really, I've read where since the IRS, right, sent out those stimulus checks, it's really started to increase because the fraudsters are now starting to take those or steal those from the blue boxes, and they're using walkers to set up fake bank accounts so they can cash checks stolen from those blue mailboxes, or uh, uh, from those checks that they are able to get you to reroute, right, to a new remittance address. So that means that if you're doing right now a confirmation call for bank account changes, you really need to start doing that confirmation call also for any remittance address changes for your check payment vendor. So that has changed or has evolved. The next thing, we've heard about it before, is the ishing scams, I call them, right? So beyond phishing, so it's not just via email that fraudsters are getting folks to give up personal information, including login credentials. It's phishing where they're doing it by phone or by voicemail. And since your phishing training has been so good, right? Again, I didn't say cybersecurity training wasn't good or necessary. It's just not enough. But since the phishing training has been so good and effective, right? The fraudsters have evolved. Now they're doing a hybrid phishing email. They send that phishing email and then tell you to call a number, and that's when you'll get phished or social engineered. And so also smishing, right? That's by text. And one thing you may not know is that USPS, this always comes up at holiday time, right? About your packages. So USPS, who is typically a last mile deliverer, they really will never include a text message or a link in a text message for shipping packages. But guess what? Fraudsters will, right? So are you getting that information? The next one is phishing, which is phishing by QR code. That's new, and I do have a QR code in here, but trust me, it is valid. But then also the latest one is phishing, which is by video call, which we will look at on the next slide as part of deepfake video fraud. Now, the last one is email takeover. So really, fraudsters are in your vendor's email, right? Sending requests from old email strings to make them look more legitimate. So that training that only says, right, to look for a spoofed email, look for an extra letter. Really, that will not always work because that email address will be legitimate. Now, another way that they are continuing to evolve is they're using deepfake audio and video to perpetrate fraud, right? We've all heard about the $35 million deepfake audio and the or $35 million fraud that was lost based on the deepfake audio, and then the $25.6 million that was lost based on the deepfake video. But there are more recent scams, including in June, right, last month, where there was a Zoom call or a phishing where 4 million HK was lost. And I think that's like a half a million USD. So it's continuing to happen. And if you want to keep up with new scam alerts and read more on these individual scams, you can click on the new scam alerts link in the PDF. And by the way, all the links that I have on screen in the PDF, they are clickable. So the question I posed was this was what cybersecurity professionals are overlooking, right, by only providing cybersecurity awareness training. It's really too general to prevent fraudulent payments. And why do I say that? Well, number one, we always hear about do not click on links or attachments from senders that we don't know. Well, heck, most of the times the AP team, the vendor teams, right, we don't have the relationships with these vendors. We don't know who they are. A lot of times we get things out of the blue. And so most of the things we get, right, are from senders that we don't know. Next, we get this, and it's not to say it's not also good, right? We get a reference that tells us, look at all these places because all these different places can have fraudulent information or be just not correct. There's one out there that has like 26 different points, and that's all great and good. But in accounts payable, we get a lot of invoices, right? We get lots of emails, lots of inquiries, and lots of times we have quotas and we're going very fast. So it's not always that easy for every invoice to be checked thoroughly. It should be, but the amount of invoices that we have, the amount of vendor requests that we have, sometimes we have to speed through those. And so we need another way or other ways to catch that fraud if we don't recognize it in the email. Now, the next thing is urgency. It's always urgency is a red flag. And that's kind of true. But if you ask any of your internal team members who's submitting an invoice, they would all say it's urgent, right? Especially during year end where everything is really urgent because you want to get those invoices in. But the problem is that you've had invoices that have been on vendors or your internal team members' desk all year, doesn't have a vendor, and now all of a sudden it's urgent. So the urgency is something that's very familiar in accounts payable and on the vendor team. And so it's not always that red flag that they think it is. So you put these together with a request to change banking or remittance addresses, right, for check payments sent by the fraudsters from within the vendor's email, and you put those two together and the other things, the other issues that you're dealing with, right? And you recognize that cybersecurity awareness training is just not enough to prevent payment fraud. And who thinks that the confirmation call, right, is the answer or solution to it all? Not me. And I will rephrase what I read last September in an article on LinkedIn. It was from a security company. And they said, right, if there's something suspicious, just make that simple phone call. Well, here's why that simple phone call is not so simple. It is not a silver bullet. It has never been easy. And the reasons now are because sometimes you just do not have contact information in your accounting system or ERP, or you don't have the right contact information. Next, you can't reach the vendor. Let's say you do have contact information, but you can't reach the vendor. I will tell you that I've gone to in-person conferences, and I've been told by practitioners just like you that they go out to try to get better contact information to reach someone to make that confirmation call, and the vendors themselves have taken that information off of their website because they themselves want to protect their team members against fraud. The next one is maybe you do have contact information, but it is the wrong person. How many of you may have maybe the sales team or whoever it is that the internal team member or that the procurement team speaks to, right, that is not the right person to make that confirmation of a banking change or remittance change? Or maybe you have vendors in a different country, right, and there's a language barrier because English is not their first language. Also, with the country piece is, the time zone differences can really come into play when you're trying to make that confirmation call. And then also, there's no authentication, right? You don't know if that's the right person you should be talking to. And I will also say, many of you may not believe me, but if you are not the one making that confirmation call, then you don't really know if the right person is being contacted, really for that matter, if the person that's doing the confirmation call is using the information from the email, which is a no-no. We know that. I know that. You know that. But do your direct reports really know that when they're using or they're viewing that as just another thing for them to do that they have to get off their plate? There's no contact information in the system. The vendor doesn't have a web presence, or if they do, contact information is not there. And so, what do they do to get it off their plate? They will use what's in the email. And in order for that to be valid, there has to be some type of authentication so you can make sure you are talking to your vendor and not to a fraudster. Also, the vendor contact will not confirm. Another thing I learned at the last vendor conference or last AP conference in person that I went to is that they did contact the right person, but those AR folks said, "Hey, our bosses or leaders told us not to confirm banking on the phone because if you think about it, they don't know who you are either." Right. And so that can happen. Also, it can just be inconsistent or not being done. Maybe, right, they've contacted the vendor 2 or 3 times. The vendor hasn't picked up. And so they're doing other things that counts towards their productivity for the day. Or it's just not being done at all because the request for a bank change or remittance address change was sent from a historical email in the vendor's actual inbox. And so the assumption is that the request is valid. And so this confirmation call for these reasons and probably more is not that silver bullet, because if it was, we wouldn't even be here talking about fraud. So what I say again is that cybersecurity awareness training is just not enough, and this is another reason why. What you really need is customized fraud training, looking at least 3 things, looking at the industry, right? Government versus healthcare versus attorneys versus nonprofit versus Fortune 500 versus SMBs, all have different requirements. They have different validations to make sure it's not a fraudster. They have different types of payments that certain fraudsters focus on. So, for example, with governments, they know you have construction projects. They wait for that. Those Fortune 500 companies. There was an example of a Fortune 500 company that hired an entertainer, paid a lot of money, hired an entertainer to come to an event. That was all on social media. There are fraudsters that focus on that, right? And successfully submitted a request to change payment details, and it was actually paid. So you have to make sure you take into account what types of payments are being made based on your industry, and include that in the training as well. The next thing you have to look at is location. Where are you located? Where are your vendors located? Do you have an office, right, that you can, where you can make that confirmation call, maybe in their local language, in their time zone? Plus, non-U.S. vendors need different validations. They also may need special accommodations for that authentication or confirmation call. And then you also need to look at your vendor process, right? How are you collecting your vendor supporting documentation? Is it coming from risky email? Is it coming from an internal team member, right? And I don't know, maybe they got it from crook.com. They haven't been trained. So now let's look at the 5 steps to customize training to prevent fraud. And so the first thing is step one, you really need to identify the team members in the vendor setup and maintenance process that needs the customized training. So I recommend you create a process map. You review vendor processes by function, help desk inquiries, new vendor adds, existing vendor changes, remittance validation, especially those that have someone else performing that confirmation call for segregation of duties issues, and then also anyone performing your vendor master file cleanup. So this can be your vendor team members, your accounts payable team members, your help desk team members, or your internal team members. Maybe they are collecting the vendor supporting data for you, help desk team members answering vendor inquiries. And then what are other team members also, what may they be doing for you as well. This can also include teams like your treasury team. When I was a practitioner, we would not only save banking, but treasury would also save banking in their software that they would use to make the wire transfer. So you need to make sure that you are including all team members that touch the vendor setup and maintenance process. Now, also with that process map, identify the processes that you're using that could result in fraud. So, are you answering the telephone, right, for inquiries? And so then you have to wonder, are you communicating with your vendor, your internal employee, or a fraudster? Are you accepting email documentation from vendors, including right the invoices and the supporting documentation to be set up or to be changed via email? We know that's risky. Do you have your internal team member collecting vendor documents? Right, you need to have them trained, and that can also be a source where you're getting in fraudulent information because they have been social engineered. The next one is really lack of authentication, right? How do you know who you're getting the documents from? Do you authenticate them to make sure you're getting them from your internal team members or from your vendors? Also, are you missing any validations that can confirm that the vendor and the vendor's information is valid and belongs to the vendor? Now, step three is once you know who needs to be trained and once you know what processes the processes that where you have gaps that could let in fraud, now you have to go ahead and design and develop the training content and materials. Now, the three things you want to make sure that you include is the fraud avoidance challenges, like what's really wrong with email collection? What's really wrong with that confirmation call? What can go wrong with bank account validation? Did you know that fraudsters are now setting up accounts using the vendor's real information? So if you do the bank account validation with that does not include, let's say, looking at account activity, then that success really may not mean anything because it actually is a real account using the vendor's real information. It's just controlled by a fraudster. So you need to make sure that you have those types of things outlined for those that are attending, so that they know what is wrong and why this training is needed. And then don't forget too to use real examples. Make them tailored to your industry, to your vendors, to your locations, to your vendor processes, so that you make it relevant. And if you have an example from your company, use it. The next one is making sure you include techniques and tools to combat, right? So include things like the telltale signs for AI fraud, right? And user tools that can detect or help you identify whether or not an email domain may be fraudulent. Also include internal controls, best practices, authentication techniques, and vendor validations to prevent the fraud that you can't catch in email. Now, you can do this on your own, or you can work with a service provider to develop and deliver it. Now, here are some examples still in step three of where you can get that material for that training. You can use free webinar series that I have this year. It's in 5 steps. That's a list of all the webinar recordings that are available. Last year was 20 tips in 20 minutes, right? And there's some topics there that would be relevant from your training as well. And this is, again, free training and content. More free training and content. There are three free training sessions that are included on the Vendor Process Training Center. You would set up a free account that'll also get you access to more resources as well. I also have a YouTube channel where I have content, Vendor Master File Tips of the Week, videos on, avoiding fraud when adding new vendors or changing existing vendors, right? Tips for adding new vendors or existing vendors that help to make sure you're compliant and you don't have bad vendor data. I also have a podcast that is on included on the YouTube channel as well. And then there are some free paid trainings and content resources. These are AP organizations. IOFM is for the US, IFOL is for the US, Canada, and the UK, and then the AP Association is for the UK. And then, of course, the Vendor Process Training Center that I have that really caters to US, but can also accommodate non-US as well. And it is also only focused on vendor setup and maintenance process. And that is the training schedule that you have in your handout. Now, step number 4 is to deliver the training, and it needs to be virtual live or in person live because you want it to be engaging. You also want it to be interactive so they can ask questions. Also give them access to download tools and templates, right? Provide links to access the tools to combat, and provide downloads for the templates that you introduce in the training to combat fraud. And then also make sure that it's recorded for future use. Recorded for those that are not able to attend, for new team members and make it part of their onboarding, or just for the team members that want to rewatch certain sections. And then lastly, step number 5 is post-training. So make sure that you test the team member comprehension and that they have access to continued training, because again, fraudsters are always evolving, so you want to rinse and repeat, keep up with evolving fraud, have them have access to continued resources for continued training so that you're always up to date on what the fraudsters are doing. Now, that is it with the 5 steps. I realize we are a minute over. Again, my apologies for the technical issues, but here are the 5 steps. And again, you can deliver the training or have a third party deliver it, or a combination of them both. Now, I will talk about just briefly my customized fraud training. It has everything that I included in this webinar, and you can click or take a picture of the QR code to schedule an initial meeting, or just click on the link there to get more information. Now, here is just a slide on how to contact me. I talked about my podcast. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Here's a direct link to the podcast page, or a link to my YouTube channel where you'll find the podcast, as well as the Vendor Master File Tips of the Week videos that I talked about. Again, my apologies for the technical issues. I can stay on as long as necessary, but here is the time for any Q&A. If you think of questions afterwards, you can always email me at info@debrarichardson.com, and I will reply to you within 24 hours. Now, I do see questions, and most of it was related to the technical issues. Yeah, they're all related to the technical issues. So thanks, everyone. I do see that everyone came back. I do appreciate that. Again, I can stay on as long as necessary if there are any questions related to the webinar training. What I will do is tomorrow, when you receive the link to register for the recording, I will fix the recording so that it is very smooth. So if you want to rewatch that, feel free to do it. If you want to share it again with other colleagues or other team members that you think will find it helpful, you can do that as well. But at this point now, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to call for a last call for any questions to see if there are anything that I can answer before we end the webinar today. All right, so I don't see any different questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone for attending today. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, and be on the lookout tomorrow for the link for the recording, and I will see you guys on the next webinar. Thanks everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Goodbye now.
All right, so I hope you got a couple of things out of that cybersecurity awareness training gaps and how to plug up that gap. And again, just in time for year end. So, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 310th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.